Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jure Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Aurelien Mondon. He's a senior lecturer in politics, languages and international studies at the University of Bath in the UK, and he's the co-editor of the 2020 book Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far-Right Became Mainstream, alongside Aaron Winter. We spoke about a number of things in this conversation. We first started by me asking him how has the far-right been mainstreamed, and we focused on the US, the UK, and France throughout this conversation. He discusses the nuanced differences between liberal racism versus illiberal racism. He argues that calling the far-right populist is very problematic, and he explains why. He then explains his concept of the populist hype and how can the media be complicit in normalizing the far-right. He discussed how the working class can become racialized into the so-called white working class. He discussed the role of elites in this reactionary democracy, or in a reactionary democracy. And we then had kind of broader conversations on like how our knowledge of the world is constructed, i.e. how it's mediated through the media, among other things. How the right wing has asphyxiated the media landscape. We discussed the role of echo chambers, the generational divide, the question of race within quote-unquote populism and elections. And towards the end, we focused a bit more on France. So that's it for me, folks. This is a really important conversation. I hope you find it instructive, and as always, I would love to hear from you via email or via the Patreon page. Thank you for listening, and take care.
My name is Aurelien Mondon. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bath in politics. My research is predominantly on the mainstreaming of far-right discourse and far-right ideas. I've also worked on racism, Islamophobia, populism, and the misuses of the concept of populism. And more recently, I've been working and interested in abstention and the kind of construction of the working class and the white working class to justify reactionary narratives.
Well, that's perfect for this podcast.
I thought it would be, yeah.
Okay, so there are a lot of terms that we'll probably be using. Myself, I've almost stopped completely using the term populism just because I get confused, to be honest. I confuse myself when I speak about it. So, but let's kind of pin that, and we'll kind of expand upon these terms in a bit. But you go a lot in your book, which I should say is called Reactionary Democracy, and you co-wrote it with Aaron Winter. And part of the question that you try and answer is like, how have racism and the far right become mainstream, right? So can we sort of start from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we try to do with Aaron in the book is really the result of quite a few years of us collaborating, but also of our individual trajectories, which have been looking at the far right and the extreme right, but also at the way their ideas have kind of traveled from the margins to the extreme, to the mainstream, but also from the mainstream to the margins and then back to the mainstream in many ways. So what we look at really is a historical trajectory, and what we try to map in the book and in our research prior to that is the current reactionary context and what has led us to where we are at the moment, where actually we see the return of ideas that we felt had been put in the dustbin of history, the never again after the Second World War. So what we try to challenge in a way is the narratives that rose straight after the Second World War, this idea that evil had been defeated, what Robert Meister called after evil. Evil is defeated in the Second World War, the Nazis are defeated, Hitler dies. So does Mussolini, and this is it. We are moving on. There will no longer be biological racism. Of course, it's a fallacy. Biological racism remains still deeply anchored in society, in various societies, including the societies that won the Second World War, such as the United States, France, the UK, and so on. I mean, we still have Jim Crow laws, segregation, and so on, various colonial racist policies that are ruling various empires until quite late. The 60s in certain countries, the White Australia policy, and officially until 1971. And so what we try to look at in a way is kind of this post-Second World War settlement where racism is seen as an aberration and as something that has been defeated and something that will not come back to liberal democracies. And we try to challenge that and to show that actually racism was always there. And the extreme forms of racism, or what we call in the book illiberal racism, were latent and were used by liberal forms of racism, liberal articulations of racism, to actually justify their place by saying we are not the illiberal racists, therefore we are fine. And what we look at is particularly the last 30, 40 years where illiberal racism is rearing its ugly head through what we call the reconstructed far right, which takes different shapes and forms. And so what we look at really is France, the UK, and the US, because we feel that, well, they are the case studies we know best. But we also feel that they each show a different kind of facet of this kind of reconstruction and the rise of what we call reactionary democracy, which is the use of democratic terms and symbols for reactionary ends.
Thanks for that. It's very interesting that there's UK, France, and the US as your focus. The guest I had on, David Andres, some weeks ago, that's episode 67 for listeners. He also focuses on those three specific countries, so that's very interesting. And I also had Reem Sarah Alwan. Although we focused on France, she did mention quite a lot how the and maybe we can get into this a bit, like how the far right in France is conceptualizing itself. But anyway, that's so that I'm pinning that as well. You mentioned some terms like, illiberal racism versus liberal racism. And I think many people, it's fair to say, would see liberal and racism as contradictory. I mean, I don't, but many people would. So how would you define these two terms?
Well, this is actually what we were really interested in, and what got us together, got us thinking together with Aaron in many ways, is kind of this idea that on the one hand you have liberalism and on the other you have racism, and that liberalism somehow will be a bulwark against racism and against the extreme right and against the far right. And this is something that historically is blatantly wrong, really. Factually, it's blatantly wrong. Liberalism has not always been essentially against racism. At times, it has co-opted anti-racist struggles, but at times it has also been very much part of racist white supremacy and relied on white and racist white supremacy. And this is what we kind of try to show with the two articulations in a way. So the way it works, to put it very simply, and obviously I'm not doing justice to kind of the thousands of words we've written about that, but illiberal racism in our societies is the kind of forms of racism that are the most blatant, the most violent, usually linked to kind of the extreme right, neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, people throwing pigs' heads at mosques, for example, people drawing swastikas on synagogues, racist protests, the British National Party in the UK, Génération Identitaire in France, or the various kind of neo-Nazi, neo-fascist movements, white supremacist movements in the US. And of course, that includes white terrorism as well, obviously white supremacist terrorism. And this kind of illiberal racism is denounced by pretty much everyone, and not just the liberals, but it's also denounced very importantly by the far right and what we call the reconstructed far right. So people like Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, even Donald Trump to some extent, although Donald Trump was an interesting character here because quite often he made the borders even fuzzier than we argued they were when we started working on the book. So the borders between liberal and illiberal racism are always fuzzy, but what illiberal racism serves a purpose that allows liberal racists, people who try to pretend that they're not racist, that they belong into the kind of liberal, if you want, hegemony, to say we're not racist because we're against these people, we think drawing swastikas on synagogues is terrible, and so on. And instead, what these liberal racists buy into is the kind of what has been called by various authors cultural forms of racism, or new racism, if you want. The idea that, it's not about the superiority of a race over another, it's about different cultures, but of course, just in the same essentialized manner. Quite often, liberal racism also tap into potentially progressive concepts. In France, for example, it taps into laïcité, and uses laicity against Islam and against Muslim people in an essentialized and racist and racialized manner. In the UK, in the US, you can think about free speech as well. The way free speech is used to kind of say, well, we should be able to say racist things, even though we disagree with racist things, we should be able to say these things. And of course, this is a completely spurious understanding of what free speech is about, and also the way speech is distributed in our societies. It can also take the form of what Jasbir Puar has called homonationalism and what Sarah Faris has called femonationalism. So homonationalism is the idea that in the West, LGBTQIA plus people, have equality pretty much, and it's the other, the kind of usually Muslim people, again, these essentialized Muslim people in a real kind of Orientalist way, that is the threat to gay rights. And the same thing, it's the Muslim people, the Muslim men, the Muslim brothers, the Muslim fathers, the Muslim cousins that are a threat to women as well. Of course, again, completely spurious account of liberal societies, right? Because as we can see very clearly today, when you look at trans issues, for example, LGBTQIA plus people don't have equal rights and are not treated equally. If you look at Hungary as well, you can see that we are seeing setbacks within the EU, and the same for women's rights, obviously, and gender equality. Right, we are way off equality, and yet it is used in this racialized manner.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so part of what I get at, I'm getting from you, is that a lot of the tensions around, or a lot of the way the far right becomes mainstream is literally they get to define what is speech in the first place, like what counts as free speech, what then counts as acceptable speech and unacceptable speech. Obviously swastikas and doing Sikh Heil and that sort of thing, that's kind of like, well, that's too obvious, we can't do that kind of thing. But then we will use other methods essentially. And you do mention quite a lot of how calling the far right quote unquote populist can be a trap. I don't personally, I don't always understand how or when. So let me rephrase this. I don't understand when it can't be a trap, because it kind of feels in my mind like it's always a trap, but I suppose it's a bit more nuanced to that. Because the reason why it is often a trap is that it implies in the popular imagination, popular, pun intended, that there is a link between populist and popular, obviously. And therefore that those calling themselves populist are inherently closer to quote unquote the people. And of course they get to define who the people are or is as a category in the first place. So can you sort of explain that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on, really. And look, I've been working on populism for quite a while now, and I've also been working on what I've termed with some of my colleagues populist hype, which is the idea that populism is misused and that has kind of problematic, if not dangerous, consequences. Nowadays, I've come to the conclusion that actually I'm trying not to use populism in public discourse. So I think there is a use for populism, but I think it's very limited. And I think this use of populism is within circles of people who actually know what they're talking about, and it's very kind of niche, kind of expert scholar kind of groups where people can actually go to the bottom of things. It's not a question of being of superior intelligence in any way, shape, or form, but it's a question of having worked on these concepts for a long time and knowing where each other comes from, which of course you can't do in a newspaper article, and you can't do on a television program or something like this. So that's why nowadays the only time I will use populism in the mainstream press, when I write an article or in a podcast, it's to actually debunk it in a way, or to kind of warn people about the misuses of populism. And I think your concerns about the use of populism are spot on. But the sad thing about that is that it's not new at all. And not only it's not new, but it's something that the far right itself has tried to impose for a very long time. If you go back to the history of the Front National, for example, in the 1990s, Jean-Marie Le Pen was really keen on imposing the concept of populist to describe himself and his politics. And of course, why wouldn't he do that, right? Until then he was called extreme right at best or fascist at worst. And he's trying to push something different. So he tried to push, nationalist, all these kind of things. But, populist is something that he really, really tried to push in the 1990s. And the populist hype, even though it wasn't called like that, is something that's been explored for quite a while. In 2004, Annie Kollowald wrote a brilliant book called about the Front National. So 2 years after Jean-Marie Le Pen gets to the second round of the presidential election in France. And of course, there's a massive hoo-ha in the media in 2002. Everyone is saying, oh my God, the fascists are at the door. I mean, this was the first time I voted, actually, back in 2002. This was my first experience of liberal democracy, really, or of acting in liberal democracy, I guess. And all the kind of newspapers were like, after the first round, when Jean-Marie Le Pen is through, They're like, oh my God, the wolf is at the door, fascists are at the door. We need to save the republic. We need to save democracy. We all need to go and vote for Jacques Chirac, the right-wing corrupt candidate in the second round. All the parties, bar one, bar the kind of workers' struggle party, so Trotskyist party, said they would encourage their voters to go and vote for Jacques Chirac. So even, like the kind of Communist Revolutionary League encouraged their voters to go and vote for Jacques Chirac in the second round. It's huge, right? And I remember demonstrating in 2002 in the streets against the Front National. And then in the second round, Jean-Marie Le Pen is defeated. He gets 18%. Jacques Chirac gets 82%, like some kind of incredible score for a democracy, really. And everyone's like, oh, democracy is saved, the republic is saved, and all that. But it's a complete misreading of the situation, because there was absolutely no way Jean-Marie Le Pen could win that election. And in fact, Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002, his results in the first round is stagnating. His results are very similar in terms of proportion of the electorate as they were in 1995, 7 years prior, but also as they were in 1988, 14 years prior. So over a 14-year span, even though he gets a lot of coverage, Jean-Marie Le Pen fails to increase his vote by much. He increases it a little bit, but the electorate increases as well. So actually, when it comes to a percentage of the entire electorate, it's a very meager increase. What happens instead, and why he gets to the second round, is because abstention skyrockets. And also, the vote share of the main three parties in France that have governed France for decades totally collapses, to the point that actually, if you gather all the votes that the main three parties that have been governing France for years and years and years, they actually equal the amount of people who decide to abstain. Instead of talking about abstention, instead of talking about the distrust in mainstream parties and the crisis of democracy, which was already well covered at the time, the French media, French politicians, and French academics to some extent decided to focus on Le Pen and the rise of Le Pen. And so what does that lead to? That leads to Nicolas Sarkozy saying like, oh, well, I'm going to go and get Le Pen's voters one by one, and so on and so forth, right? And in 2004, again, there's this warning, to go back to the populist issue. There's this warning by Kolovald, who says, c'est un dangereux contresens. This is a dangerous false meaning. We shouldn't call them populist. We have very good terms that have been used that have been defined very thoroughly by academics, by the media, by everyone. Why should we use populist? Because by using the word populist, we legitimize the Front National by linking them to the people, as you said before, but we also delegitimize the people by linking them to this awful fascist beast. And it's not any kind of people that we delegitimize, of course, because the people that's associated usually with the far right since in the 2000s, really, and increasingly ever since, is a particular kind of people. It's the working class. And in this process, the working class becomes racialized because, of course, it's not any working class that votes for the far right, right? It's not any working class that votes for Le Pen, for Brexit, or for Trump. It's the white working class. And by doing so, we racialize that white working class, saying that they have to be racist and they can't think about economics. But we also completely erase the diversity of the working class, even though the working class, of course, is the most diverse part of our populations, right? So there's this kind of problem of legitimization of the far right and its ideas by linking them to the people, and the delegitimization of the concept of the people core to democracies by linking them to the far right. And this is what some of us have called populist hype since, building on Kolovald's work. Some of the people that I've discovered recently in France as well, Palombarini and Amable, have written some really good stuff on that as well. And yet these warnings are not heeded. And what I've tried to show recently in my work with Katie Brown in particular is how the number of even academic articles that use the term populism, how it has increased massively. And it has completely obscured or meddled, if you want, the field. And now what we call populism is in fact more often than not the far right. The other problem with populism as well is that because we usually link populism to the far right, other populist movements on the left tend to be, painted in a very negative manner. And that's what some of my colleagues have called the anti-populism kind of movement, in a way that is like, well, all populists are the same, the horseshoe theory, whether you're left or right, you're just as dangerous for democracy. And of course, that leads us to a situation where you have a choice between the liberal status quo or the awful populist authoritarians, which of course, Podemos is not the Front National, right, or the Rassemblement National.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a lot there, and I've gotten horseshoe theory thrown at me quite a lot because I do focus quite a bit of my work on like anti-authoritarianism on the left. And so it has led, I've been interviewed, for example, on like a podcast, and it's led the host to say that he's fond of a horseshoe theory, and he doesn't identify as a leftist because for him there are these two extremes, and of course they meet somewhere, you know, in the middle somehow. And I obviously reject that, and you know, I make it very clear that there's a very specific danger to the far right, that regardless of whatever criticism one might have towards the authoritarians on the left, there's something very specific about what we're talking about. But just to go back on populist hype, it's a question I wanted to ask in a bit, but since you brought it up now, I know that you've done a case study on The Guardian, for example. How has The Guardian covered quote-unquote populism? I'll ask you if that's okay to sort of bring that study up and just explain like some of those findings. And because, yeah, I have a commentary on like the media coverage of that in general, specifically when it comes to the quote-unquote refugee crisis, because I think that ties into to what we'll be talking about. So can you just kind of present that first?
Of course. So in 2018, the Guardian ran a 6-month series on the new populism, or what we call the new populism. With Katie Brown, we decided to actually look at it over a year. So starting on the first day of the series and spanning over a year, because we saw that actually even after 6 months, many articles were still published using the same kind of graphics as the series. So it was like kind of fancy, cool graphics with, you know, like nice designs and so on and so forth. So we looked at a 1-year span from the start to a year after. We also wrote then a chapter with Aaron Winter focusing more on racism as well, and the way racism is euphemized through that coverage. And so what we did with Katie Brown is looked at all these articles. There were thousands of them. Many of them, actually, most of them used populism only once in the articles. Some of them were incredibly serious, written by academics who were sometimes even warning about the danger of misusing populism. And some of them were completely frivolous in a way. You know, some were, for example, using populism to describe Ed Sheeran, you know, the musician, or to describe Sweet Home Alabama, or, you know, things that had nothing to do with populism not being explained. So that led to this kind of idea that populism could be anything. It could even be fluffy. We found in our corpus. So what we looked at is we looked at the corpus, looked at it quantitatively to see where populism appeared in the series over a year on The Guardian. And we saw that it appeared in all matters of things, sometimes serious, sometimes not, sometimes scholarly, sometimes not, and so on. More often than not, it appeared to describe the far right or far right issues. And what we found really is that it led to a process of euphemization. It euphemized the far right. It also amplified the far right. Quite often we saw that actually the coverage meant that we were talking about issues that shouldn't be talked about, because proportionally they shouldn't be talked about as much as the Greens, for example, or as the left, but somehow we talked about them because it sells. We also saw that there was what we looked at really is the kind of agenda setting process, which is that the media doesn't tell you what to think, but it tells you certainly what to think about. You know, nowadays, when people think about politics, or when people learn about politics, they learn about it through the media, not just through the media, and they don't necessarily lap up what the media tell them, but, you know, that's what shapes our understanding of the world, right? None of us have an understanding of the world that's built out of nowhere. We all have this kind of mediated process that builds our understanding of the world. It's not just the media. It could be, you know, whatever kind of religious communities you kind of hang out with. It could be your friends. It could be your family. It could be your workplace. You know, it used to be trade unions, for example. But of course, the media plays a particular part. And what we looked at in a way, and what we have been looking at in our work since, with Katie and with others, and on my own as well, is also the lack of the denial of responsibility and agency from our elite, not just the media, politicians, academics as well. This idea that whether it's the media, politicians, or even academics, they are just kind of bystanders. They kind of look at the world and describe it, but they have no power on it, which is, I think, from my point of view, fascinating, right? Because here it's the people who have most access to public discourse and to shaping public discourse, to priming ideas, to framing ideas, who tell us we are just reporting. And to us, one of the things that kind of really drove this home was one of the kind of first articles on the first day of a new populism series on The Guardian that said, between 1996 and 2000, I can't remember, no, between 2006 and 2016 or something like that, in 2006, there were 200 articles with populism. Now there's like 2,000 articles on populism or whatever, like some massive increase. What has happened? And it's like, well, you have a role to play there. No one is forcing you to write about populism. There's not the people, at the front of the Guardian who are saying, please talk about populism. No one's forcing them. And yet they're denying their responsibility in that, as if they were just simply, they come in the morning, Guardian journalists and editors, and, there's like populism at the door, and so they have to let it in. And to us, it's ludicrous. And yet this kind of denial of responsibility in terms of agenda setting is so incredibly powerful and massively understudied, unfortunately.
Yeah, so like they basically create content, and then the content increases, and then after a certain period of time, there's more content, and so that becomes in itself worthy of analysis, and then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. The coverage of migration, as I mentioned, I mean, I was in the UK during the Brexit stuff, and obviously I was there as a migrant, and or as a would-be migrant. A lot of the time, the definitions, a lot of the time, the way this was being portrayed or how I interpreted it was really in contrast, as in like these refugees and these migrants were in contrast with the people. There was a very strict line between who counts as the people and who doesn't count as the people, because obviously the vast majority of those that would be on those dinghy boats and whatnot would be actually part of quote unquote the people, because just statistically speaking, they would be part of the working class. Although not all, some of them were actually part of the middle classes back in Syria, for example. But anyway, in Britain, they would probably be part of the working class. And that's sort of something that I saw really like throughout the spectrum of what we call politics in general, a complicity, with some exceptions, of course, but a complicity because they end up setting the agenda, as you said. I mean, I was thinking, while you were talking, there's this new thing in the UK, obviously GBTV and whatnot. Probably won't spend too much time talking about it. But anyway, like they if they succeed and if they get a certain percentage of the population watching them, they get kind of an attention. What that can actually do is that you will have an institution like the BBC, for example, starting to look at them, because the BBC as an institution is very influenced by what is being talked about by the news, quote unquote. And if this becomes the news, if this becomes something worthy of conversation, then it will be also covered on the BBC, if you see what I mean. And so I'm wondering, like, I guess on some level, I can kind of transition, because I wanted to ask you a question about like elites. When we talk about elites, I know that your co-author Aaron Winter spoke of like elite legitimizers in one of the talks that you gave, and I'll find the link and put it in the description. And for me, like the role of elites, from like how they mostly speak to one another and platform one another on one hand, of course, but also like the disproportionate impact of something like elite panic, which is I'm gonna try and do an entire episode on it at some point. It's a fascinating phenomenon that's being studied by a lot of people. Like those things aren't as well understood as they should be by now, in my view. So if I can ask you, like, in your view, what is the role of elites in a reactionary democracy, as you call it? And I don't know if we even define what a reactionary democracy is, so feel free to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And I mean, our work, and I should have said that as well from the beginning. Our work with Aaron is very much focused on elite discourse. So really, what we're looking at is the media, politicians, and academics, because we feel that is where kind of mainstream discourse is created. Of course, it doesn't mean that people on the ground can't change things and can't shake things up, right? And you can just think about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, that has forced issues of systemic racism into the kind of mainstream discourse, although it's been kind of since kind of subsumed and things like that. But I mean, I guess that might be for later in the discussions. But to go back to your point, and I think it takes us back to the point about populism as well, right? Because the way populism is defined quite often is, the construction of the people. Some people say the pure people against the corrupt elite. And I think that's where anti-populism is particularly problematic in a way. And anti-populist discourse is particularly problematic. This idea that, on one side, you have a crazy authoritarian populists that are, the horseshoe theory, left or right, they're just as bad as each other. And then you have the liberal kind of project that's in the middle and that needs to be defended because it's the bulwark against the crazy populists, against self-fulfilling prophecy here. But I think that kind of that definition of populism and that the equation of populism as something innately bad is problematic, because our elite has been very, very bad. Not all people who are part of the elite are terrible, just like not every, like lots of kind of Guardian journalists are brilliant journalists as well. But it's as a whole, the kind of discourse that is created in elite circles has been deeply damaging to our societies. We have seen the rise of inequality, we have seen global warming, over the environmental crisis now, and nothing is being done about it, even though the people who have the power to change things very easily could do that. Again, not saying that the people on the ground can't change things, but it's a lot harder for them to do it. And also, the people on the ground who are trying to change things are fighting the people at the top who don't want things to change because they benefit so much from them. So I think, being against, or not necessarily being against an elite in an essential way is that's not what I'm saying, but I think we need to be able to be critical of our elite, particularly when our elite is sending us in the war as a whole, as a project, right? And I think that's important. And what we've discussed in our work with Aaron, in a way, is the way quite often in our mainstream discourse we've seen a diversion away from key issues and from issues that really apply to all of us and that most of us care about, onto issues that are irrelevant and quite often reactionary in many ways. And that's where that leads us to reactionary democracy, because what we call reactionary democracy is the idea of blaming reactionary ideas onto the people by saying, well, if we have reactionary policies, if we have, barbed wires around the borders of Europe, if we have barbed wires around the borders of the UK, if we have a hostile environment, if we have Grenfell, if we have the wall in the Mexican at the Mexican border, this is because that's what the people want. And what we're trying to challenge with Aaron is this idea that that's what the people want. It's not what the people want. It's not even factually what the people want. If you look at elections, Trump was elected by 25% of registered voters in the US. That doesn't even take into account all the people who have been kicked out of the voting registers, right? With voter suppression and all of that in the US. If you look at the UK, the same thing happened with Brexit. Brexit won by 37%. Mostly it's wealthy people who voted for it, and same with many other countries as well. So they hardly kind of plebiscitary movements or politics that are being pushed like that. One of the things that I've looked at as well, and I'm sorry if you wanted to talk about it later, but I'll bring it up now, is also how our knowledge of the world, and I've mentioned it already before, but it's something that I'm really fascinated about at the moment, is how our knowledge of the world is constructed, and how, what we think are important issues at a given time. And various people have studied that. This is nothing new, right? The idea that, we have mediated knowledge, that, this is Benedict Anderson, for example, about imagined communities, but many other people have talked about it as well before that, the fact that our knowledge is mediated. Stuart Hall talked about it as well. And yet, reactionary democracy, in a way, tells you that you can just ask the people, and the people will tell you that they're really concerned about immigration, or that they have legitimate grievances about cultural issues or whatnot, but they care more about cultural issues, but they care about economic inequality, for example. And what we're trying to show is that, A, it's rubbish factually, as I said before, because if you look at electoral registers and all of that, that doesn't work, but also it completely removes elite power to shape the agenda. And what I've tried to do in my most recent work, something that I've started with Aaron and that I'm trying to develop now, particularly in an article that I hope will be published in the near future, is to really look at a particular survey, which I think shines some really interesting light on these issues. The Eurobarometer survey asks people across Europe two questions, well, tons of questions, but two questions that are of interest to me. One is, according to you, what are the two biggest issues facing your country at the moment? And then another question to the same people, according to you, what are the two biggest issues you are facing at the moment? So personally, you are facing at the moment. When it's about your country, immigration is really high in the UK or even across the EU. What's fascinating about immigration as well, if you look at it across a period of time, is that it kind of fluctuates. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, and it fluctuates according to particular events that are more or less covered. So for example, in 2015-16, whether it's in the UK or in the EU, immigration becomes a massive concern. It's when it's the highest it is over a 10-year period. It's a peak. Why is it a peak, right? Well, in the UK, 2015-16 is, of course, a Brexit referendum, right? And the Brexit referendum campaign, which is massively about immigration. But it's also the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. If you move to 2017, immigration is far less of a concern already. when it's to people according to their country, even though refugees are still here. There's still refugees coming in, although far less, of course. But then again, the bulk of refugees stayed in Germany. They didn't come to most other countries, right? And in the UK, we have Brexit, but we still have as much immigration as we used to, and immigration rules won't change until 2020, right? So we can see again that the coverage matters here. Just to give you an example of how the coverage matters, some colleagues at King's College did some brilliant research on the coverage of a campaign of a Brexit referendum. And what they saw is that even though the economy was the biggest issue talked about by the media, immigration was second, but it was also the one that was on most front pages, and that it was mostly covered in very negative terms. So when we talked about immigration during the campaign, they didn't talk about people like me, right? I'm an expat. They talked about, refugees. They probably talked about Muslim people in an essentialized, racialized manner, such as terrorism and linked to terrorism and so on and so forth. But to go back to my Eurobarometer survey, the same people are asked the same question, but about themselves personally, and given the same options. And here, immigration doesn't rate. I think it's 14th across a 10-year period. The biggest concerns are the cost of living, education, pensions, and things like that. So why is that? Well, what I'm not trying to say here is that one is correct and the other is wrong, right? And I'm not even trying to say that people don't care about immigration. This is irrelevant. This is not the problem. What I'm trying to show really through this research is that we can't simply trust opinion surveys to tell us what the people think or want. And this is nothing new. This is something that people wrote about 100 years ago when they started opinion surveys, right? People who believed in opinion surveys wrote about it and say, well, look, there are problems with that, of course. All of this is constructed. It doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. Doesn't mean it's not useful, but it means we need to take it critically. We can't just believe that we can just ask the people and whatever they say is exactly what they think. You're priming them, you're asking them certain questions, you're giving them certain options. These people are making decisions about things they might never have thought about, or they might just base their decision on whatever they've read in the newspaper this morning or in the kind of news report this evening or something like that. And so what I'm trying to show is that our knowledge is mediated, and what we are told the people want day in, day out, which is, more controls on the borders, more focus on kind of reactionary cultural issues and things like that. Well, it depends how you ask people, and it depends who you call the people, and it depends who you interview, who you ask, and when you ask them, and how you ask them. And I think, there would be some very, very easy way to have a more critical, nuanced approach to politics and to political discourse. But we choose not to do it as an elite, whether it's in the media, politicians, or academics quite often, really.
It reminded me there was during the Brexit stuff. I think it was just after the results came in, and there was a huge panic and everything in the days after, days and months and years after. But in the immediate aftermath, there was a person being interviewed somewhere in the English North or something like that, if I remember correctly. And he was asked why did you vote for Brexit? And he said immigration. And then he was kind of asked a follow-up question, which immigration, what kind of immigration, what we're talking about. And he said, I'm actually fine with EU's coming along, but it's all those Syrians and Iraqis and Afghanis that I have a problem with. And yet, obviously, Brexit is not about Syrians and Afghanis and the others. But there was this very palpable sense. And again, I was in London, despite knowing the facts, intellectually, there was a sense that, well, this is what everyone is talking about. So this has to be something, this has to be an issue, even though you then look at the fine print, which shouldn't be fine print, of well, how many refugees has the UK actually accepted? And it's a ridiculously low number. And there was just this sense that they get to, or what I started realizing later on is that they really get to shape the narrative. They get to shape the stories and what counts and what doesn't count. And I believe even while you were talking, I believe that even in the years before Brexit, before it started becoming a thing, before David Cameron made that promise, for example, that there will be a referendum, quite a lot of those are also national posture, immigration was not that big of a priority. And I think especially in the aftermath of 2012 Olympics, there was this kind of high in some ways. But so with all of that in mind, another aspect which personally really worries me, and I've brought it up a number of times, and maybe I'm a bit obsessed about social media, I don't know. But you've mentioned how there's a rise in the term populism, right? Even in academic discourse. And personally, I can't help, especially because we know the demographics that are on Twitter. Like now we have kind of that kind of data. It's not all academics, obviously, but there is a disproportionate amount of academics and journalists and politicians on Twitter. That's why it's gotten recently, I think, that kind of attribute of like, that's why the elites actually are much more so than on Instagram, for example. Not that Instagram is like the people, but I can't help but wonder like of the role of, you know, echo chambers as they're usually called. And I know that's it's kind of a problematic term. It's not always well defined, but in creating this rise, because what I've seen, and sometimes I kind of saw it with my own eyes, like I really saw something, you know, and here I can bring up kind of like the Syria stuff, right? And I'll try, it's kind of a weird pivot, but I'll try and make my point, you know, coherently. But with Syria, I saw a lot of in 2014, 2015, I saw a lot of war crimes denialism becoming more and more common. It was pretty small in the early days, so in the past decade, I'm talking like post 2011. But at some point it became more and more common. Not necessarily just in terms of numbers, but also in confidence. Like people were actually more confidently, because by then I think what happened, sort of like what you mentioned with The Guardian, is that you had a number of those conspiracy theorists that had been doing this for a few years now. And now they could quote one another, they could kind of use each other's quote unquote data, and it became a mediascape, essentially. There was an entire, like right now, if one wants to be a conspiracy theorist when it comes to Syria, you don't even have to go to the dark web, right? Like you just Google things and you find like RT, Sputnik, what have you, and then you will have more mainstream things because that percolates in those circles. Anyway, but to go back to our conversation, the worry essentially of lot of self-fulfilling prophecies is what I'm getting at, because you even mentioned the statistic that it's actually like those that made under 30K, I believe, in the US actually voted more for Clinton than they did for Trump. And it's actually the middle and upper class, especially the white, obviously middle and upper class in the US, that voted for Trump. And yet to this day, I find like actual difficulty in, even if I'm having conversation with a number of people who I know would agree with me, there is still this sense in the back of my mind as if we were primed, like we have to actively deconstruct the thing that we know is wrong, that Brexit was not a working class victory, quote unquote populist victory, and that Trump wasn't as well. Even though we know this and we know the statistics, there is still sort of, it's almost like it's impolite to point it out all the time. We kind of have to maintain that story. So I do wonder if in recent years, this amplification of things on social media, the fact that you can really have a sense of, well, this is what people are talking about right now, even though it could really be a tiny fraction of the population that even know what the hell you're talking about that happened on Twitter yesterday or whatever. But it really has that sense. And I do wonder if that hasn't basically percolated, if you see what I mean, onto media, onto like mainstream media, essentially, you know. Before it used to be a section, like I remember there used to be a section of the BBC that was like, what is trending on social media, you know, something like that. But then it became the news. Not always, of course, but it became more likely to be the news, especially when it was picked up as a tool by people who make the news, by politicians, by, you know, these elites. So I wonder, like, you know, I don't know what thoughts you might have on the role of social media and all of this, and when is it like exaggerated to worry about it, and like how do you think about it? Let's put it that way.
I mean, I think there's a role of, you know, that social media has played, but I don't think it's my biggest concerns are not about social media, because I think, you know, there's always been echo chambers, right? Like our media elite has always been very, very elitist. You know, I mean, particularly in the UK, I mean, it's, you know, the journalists are really not representative of the rest of the population. And, you know, I think it probably has gotten worse as well. I mean, the fact that, you know, media concentration doesn't help these things as well. The fact that you have less and less local news or serious local news, less and less regional news, less and less people on the ground because they don't have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the funds to do it, right? So all of these kind of things are problematic. But I think, and social media might have helped this, but I think it's also down to the arrogance of our elite, and I'm part of them, right? Like when I talk about the elite, you know, I am part of the elite. Like I'm not, you know, I don't have the reach of a Guardian journalist, and I don't have the reach of Boris Johnson or a politician or anything like that. But, you know, I still have kind of like the means to, well, be, you know, like I can be on your podcast, for example. I can write for mainstream media. I have various contacts and things like that. So, I can impact in a tiny way. So, I'm to blame as well. And I think that's why we need to be reflective about these things and about the kind of meanings that we create. But I think there's a real sense of arrogance and of talking down to the people and not being reflective about the way we go about things when we actually have a certain amount of responsibility to, that's what frustrated me most about The Guardian. And that's why we chose to look at The Guardian, because, we could have looked at The Telegraph, we could have looked at some right-wing tabloid press, and, we would have found just even more outrageous stuff. But we wanted to look at The Guardian because The Guardian should know better. If we are to have functioning democracies, we need to have a range of opinions. And what's fascinating is the people who complain most about the lack of range of opinion in the media nowadays are the right, even though the right have completely asphyxiated the media landscape in a way, and all their issues are the ones that are talked about day in, day out, whether it's on the right or on the left. If you think about the UK, even The Guardian and the BBC are falling for whatever the right is throwing out there. The same in France. I mean, the landscape in France is absolutely appalling at the moment, and it's worrying for the 2022 election, and the US as well. I mean, it was insane to see the New York Times cover some neo-fascist the way they did, or even kind of independent kind of liberal magazines like Mother Jones, talk about a dapper white nationalist when they talked about Richard Spencer. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. And so I think we need more diversity of opinions. We need more diversity of voices in the media and in public discourse more generally, in politics as well. And we see that when this happens, it's great. You can see this breath of fresh air in a way, and you can see that things could turn around quite quickly. But if we don't have that, we will struggle. But I think this will take time, because I think it requires. Look, we've been so wrong as an elite for so long, and it for a lot of people, they take it to heart, right? Mm-hmm. Admitting that you've been so wrong for so long about certain things, it shouldn't be hard. We shouldn't be used to being wrong, and it shouldn't be a problem in a way, because it would show that we're learning at least, and yet we don't. And I see that in some of my colleagues as well. Sometimes people will just stick to things that are blatantly wrong, and we stick to that white working class being behind Brexit, being behind Trump so much, and it's mad. And you can show evidence to people, and they will still the next day. It's so frustrating, honestly. Colleagues and I have been writing so much about this, and yet so much has been written since, not taking into account the obvious facts. And you know what? The thing is, I'm not even blaming the colleagues who are doing that, because sometimes I do feel that prejudice when I don't think this through, and I have anecdotes of me being like, oh my God, this person is probably far right because they're working class. And then I think of myself, no, it's not true, but yet we're told that so often that when you don't think carefully, it's easy to fall into this kind of prejudice, right? We all hold prejudice to some extent. Because we have to. And again, that's going back to Lippmann 100 years ago, who was talking about public opinion. To make sense of the world, we have to simplify things. We have to make generalizations. What we need to do as well, though, if we want to be good human beings, I guess, is to reflect upon these generalizations and remember that's what they are, the generalizations, right? And then you realize that actually, maybe you can kind of redraw your generalization and redraw your map of the world. But we don't do that anymore. We're just incredibly arrogant. And one of the things that we've talked about with Jason Glinos in particular, when we kind of try to kind of theorize the concept of populist hype, is to bring in some psychoanalytic theory here, and it's really borrowing from Jason's work here on this, because he knows a lot more than me. But it really resonated with me when I looked at populism and at populism studies and so on. Is one of the concepts that really spoke to me was the concept of the theft of enjoyment, which kind of goes something like that. And I'm bastardizing it because I'm not an expert on psychoanalytic theory, but it's the idea that you will never be able to reach your enjoyment, and someone is stealing it in a way, and you're blaming someone from stealing your enjoyment. And so you could see that in far-right voters, for example, where the immigrant is stealing your enjoyment of your country, or the immigrant is stealing your enjoyment of the welfare state, or the immigrant is stealing your enjoyment of having a better life or something like that. And if only the immigrant wasn't there, it'd be great. Of course it wouldn't. It would never be great. There would be some other problems. There'd be capitalism, if anything, right? But what we argue as well is that the theft of enjoyment doesn't just play a part for far-right voters. It also plays a part for the elite, whereby if it wasn't for the people, we would have great liberal democracies. If it wasn't for the people voting for the far right or populists of left and right, then it would be amazing. We would have a free market, everything would work so well. We would have sensible politics and all of these kind of things. And you see that all the time. I mean, it's quite incredible. And I think you're right when you mentioned Twitter being an echo chamber and quite often of academics and things like that. It's like some of the discourse that is on there, it's so incredibly condescending to the people, and yet shows so little reflection. It's honestly maddening, really, sometimes just see that arrogance, in spite of being blatantly wrong and totally unreflective. Yeah.
Well, another example of elites, a previous guest, David Andres, he had there's a term used by Otto English, the writer, called of ladybird libertarians, and it's basically a term that he used for a specific section of the upper class elites that were the most pro-Brexit. And the world that they grew up in, ladybird is the travel books. The world that they grew up in is really like they lived in between embassies, and they kind of had a word of what they were experiencing, the British Empire, what was left of the British Empire, essentially. That was the thing that they had in mind, and that's what they sort of projected onto what will end up becoming Brexit. Now, I know it's more complicated than that, but the fact that it's actually a tiny percent of the population of the UK, for example, that would even have the resources to live all over the world in that sense. But the impact that those really small number of people had from really running Brexit campaigns shows, to your point of like the impacts of these elites. But like just on social media quickly, like I agree, and I think there is a way of analyzing the more maybe technical aspect of like, I try and get into like the manipulation algorithm that social media has, and try and see where this can lead. Although I would end up disagreeing with someone like Jaron Lanier, who basically says, well, more social media would essentially mean like if you have Black Lives Matter, you will have the KKK, because it's a complicated thing. You also mentioned like the essentially the destruction of a lot of local journalism, and for me, like that probably has an even bigger impact on the weakness of our public discourse, much more so than whether they're on Twitter or not. So I do agree. It's just something that's in the back of my mind a lot, because I don't fully understand to myself first and foremost, and so I try and see the guest see if the guest can answer it for me. Like, what does that do? Like, what is the impact of being on social media a lot? Is it just a matter of like not being on it a lot, from time to time, and then maybe that's okay? It's a complicated thing. Yeah.
I mean, I think like anything, right? It's how you do it, and how much you do it, and how often you do it, and what you look at. For example, like every now and then I have colleagues and even friends who tell me that, I also read some right-wing stuff just to have balance. But it's like, why? I mean, I'm sorry, like what do you have to yourself? But also, what's balance? I'm sorry, but today reading the Telegraph and reading the Guardian is not balance. You're not reading something extreme left and something extreme right. You're reading pretty much something that's extreme right and something that's center. So that balance is rubbish in a way. I think what we need is, we need to be reflective. I think what we need to be worried about with social media is we need to be worried about the corporations behind social media. Social media in and of itself could be actually quite emancipatory. It can be very dangerous as well, but I think it's how you use it. Just like the traditional media can be great, and it can be terrible as well. And I think again, it's whether you make these things democratic or not. I think that matters rather than the tool in and of itself. I think what's been fascinating as well about all these discussions, because this was one of these moral panics that kind of took place after in 2016. I mean, it started before, but in 2016 it became particularly prevalent. Fake news, all these kind of things that Marcus Gilroy Ware, for example, has covered very well in his book, and they became very prevalent. But they were blown up. Like, fake news has always existed. And fake news didn't kind of actually change the narratives on its own, right? The people who actually fell for it were not the people who were the young people who are most on social media. It was a generational thing as well. The people who are most likely to fall for fake news are people who are older. But also, there were people who voted Brexit, there were people who voted Trump, there were people who also gained from this politics. The people who voted Brexit, the generational divide was so important, and these people who are already retired have very little to lose with the post-Brexit world, right? The people who voted Trump more, like in fact, Trump between 2016 and 2020 increased his share of the vote, but he increased his share of the vote in the wealthiest part of the population. Why is that? these people didn't vote Trump because of the neo-fascists and neo-Nazis that supported him. Some of them did, but a lot of them did also because they benefited from his economic politics, right? From lower taxes, from all of these kind of things, from what they've been benefiting for voting for the Republicans for years and years and years and years, right? So it's not just about the people who are kind of taking the red pill or whatever. It's also about the people who are benefiting from white supremacy, capitalism, and all of that kind of, all of these inequalities that come with it, right? And that kind of serve each other in a loop. And some of these inequalities, they serve also our kind of liberal elite that it might say they're against fascists, they're against neo-Nazis, they're against Trump. But if it's a nicer version of Trump, like Obama, who still does lots of deportations and dodgy things and doesn't really do much to alleviate inequalities in a way that will damage the middle and upper middle class, then that's fine as well. And same with Joe Biden, right? And when you see what Biden is doing at the moment and how he's kind of reneging some of the things that he had been discussing before. Yeah, I don't. Look, I mean, I was very happy when Biden won, obviously. Well, no, I was very happy when Trump lost more than Biden winning, right? I mean, I think I should qualify that. But my worries were that, people would then forget and they'd be like, oh, that's great, we're back to normal. But normal is not good. Normal was not good before Trump, and normal is not good now. And the first noises that were made when Biden won was reconciliation. And it's like, I'm sorry, reconciliation with who? With the people who oppose Black Lives Matter, with the people who are, for a wall on the border, or with the neo-fascists who try to storm the Capitol. I mean, what a slap in the face of the kind of grassroots movement that demand a better world. Like it's, I think it's problematic, right? And yeah, I think one of the things that I think is I'm working on that's linked to that, and I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little here, but I think is one of the problems with the left at the moment is that we've been reacting a lot. We've been reacting to the far right, and we need to, right? There's no way around it. People are under so much threat. People are, suffering so much from various things, from poverty, from racism, from sexism, from transphobia, all of these kind of things, right? Even kind of things that had been gained through struggle against the capitalist liberal elite in a way, quite often, more than with them, are being threatened at the moment. So we need to react against these threats, but reacting is not enough. We also need to act, because that's what the right and the far right have been doing. They haven't just been reacting; they've been acting as well. And I think they've won the kind of the hegemonic battle, the hegemonic struggle, and we need to kind of find a counter-hegemonic struggle. And it can't just be reacting to them. It can't just be resisting. We need to go beyond that. We also need to kind of fight for something positive, which we're not doing at the moment.
No, I definitely agree with that. A lot of the episodes have basically been about, well, how can we now not only react, how can we think forward? Because I obviously agree, it's a big problem. I mean, we have some thoughts on this, but just before I forget, like, we've touched upon this a number of times, and maybe we kind of jumped around it a lot, but like the importance of race within discourses around the term populism, right? Like, the narrative that populism is driven by working class anxiety is usually either implied or explicitly stated, like, what quote unquote white working class anxieties, because non-white working class anxieties don't exist, continues to be taken for granted in a lot of journalistic and even academic circles. I mean, you've talked about this much more than I have, and it's because it is quite incredible that we can have serious op-eds saying that Trump won because of the working class. I mean, we've stated this a number of times, but it is quite serious. It's quite incredible, given what we actually know about who voted for him, and given what we know about what his policies actually were. To kind of name pretty obvious stuff, there were much more focus on, like, that meeting that he had with Kanye West, and that, freed that one or two persons, whatever, and not to the entire cultural regime, which has millions of people behind bars. And I do wonder as to the question of why. Maybe this is more philosophical. I don't really know, to be honest, but as to why there is this hesitation or this squeamishness almost around talking about race in those circles, media and academic circles, just kind of focus on two of them, because or like throughout society for that matter, because it does seem, at least on some level, clear to me that the reason why there's this unwillingness or inability maybe to discuss racism in any serious capacity I mean, with Black Lives Matter, I would definitely agree. Of course, that's been more of it. That I mean, there's no, I don't think this can be disagreed with. There's definitely more of it. But whenever there's more of it, then there's the kind of this reaction to it, and then I see that some of the people who were in favor of it, kind of taking a step back, say, okay, well, maybe we've pushed far enough for now. Maybe now we slow down. I even understand this instinct in some ways. I feel this instinct, and I'm part of the ones being racialized. I understand the the need, or maybe the instinct is like, okay, well, we've gotten rid of some statues for now. We've done this and we've done that. Maybe let's cool it down and we'll take the next step later, whatever. Because there's always this sense that there will be a next step, if you kind of follow my thought. But anyway, a lot of the time, journalists and academics and others who opt for the populism, quote unquote, trope, to me at least, end up not having to really deal with the question of race. And I'm not saying it's just a question of race. There's obviously gender, transphobia, homophobia, all of these things. But race seems at least central to a lot of these anxieties, if I can even call them anxieties. I mean, I'm basically describing racism. And as I said, I know it's not just that, but I was wondering if you can kind of talk about the role of racism in discourses around the word populism, right? And I'll also take advantage to ask if you can explain why the discourse around quote unquote the white working class is so problematic in the first place. And you've already touched upon it a bit, but if we can flesh it out a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, I mean, it's fascinating. If you, I was chatting with someone today about it. If you look at far right studies and the people who work on the far right, it's very rare when colleagues use the term racism in their research, even though we talk about movements that are racist. Yeah. What's fascinating is that instead, and I've been guilty of that as well, right? Like, a lot of my criticism applied to some of my work, and I've tried to address it, and a lot of colleagues try to address it as well, and things are changing very slowly. But I'll come back to the things changing very slowly and the idea of progress a bit later. But to go back to this idea is like, some of my colleagues will use nativism, will use populism, will use like nationalist ethnicism, whatever, like lots of kind of weird words that have been very poorly defined. Well, actually, there's a word that has been very well defined by many, many, many people. It's the word racism. We have so many good nuanced definitions of racism out there, and particularly in sociology. And yet, a lot of people refuse to use it. And you see that as well in the media, and you see that with politicians, they try not to use the word racism. And I think, it speaks to anxiety, as you said, and it speaks to things that are core to our societies, right? Our societies are white supremacist capitalist societies, and liberalism as being liberal democracies made us feel, and the histories that we've learned at school, all of these kind of things make us feel like we've triumphed over evil, that we beat the Nazis, we beat the fascists, we defeated it, we moved on. Now we have elections, we have universal suffrage, we have gained rights and things like that. And we can't be the bad guys, can we? Like, there's no way. But of course we can. Like, during the Second World War, the Allies were deeply racist societies. There was segregation in the United States. The way les indigènes, the so-called, like the people who were called indigenous in France, the soldiers from the colonies, the way they were treated in France, like, was absolutely appalling. The way colonies were used and pillaged and so on, during and after the Second World War was also appalling. What has happened still is appalling, and yet it's something that we can't reckon with, because this is something that we've pinpointed during history as racism is terrible, and we know where it leads to if you let it kind of happen, right? It leads to what happened in Nazi Germany, and of course it's erased a lot of other cases of genocide and racist genocides that have happened by other people, but we know where it happens, and we don't want to be the racists. All right, so that leads to anxiety, and acknowledging it is problematic, and acknowledging that it's systemic is problematic. And that's why more often than not, and I think, BLM was fantastic for that. I mean, that these people, these activists managed to actually put that front and center and say, no, it is systemic. It's a problem with the police as a system, not just a bad cop. And again, right, it's hard not to be cynical, and I don't want to be cynical, because I think it's amazing what has happened, but I think it's been co-opted since, and it might be absorbed and it might be diluted in a way, and I'm hoping it won't be. But I think it shows that things can be different. But I think the pushback then happens when people are like, as you said, it's like, oh, well, we need to take a step at a time, right? We can't bring down all the statues now. We need to take it slow. Progress will happen, but it takes a long time. But this is what we've been promised for decades. Progress takes a long time. In 60 years, the gender pay gap will be, if we close it, if it keeps closing at the rate it's closing at the moment, in 60 years, there won't be a gender pay gap. So you will just tell women, just wait 60 years, right? It's fine. Same with all the other inequalities. Eventually things will be fine. We just have to be patient. Progress takes time. Politics takes time. Be patient. When you'll be my age, you'll understand, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, but no, but this is not how it works. This is not based on any real understanding of history. History does not work like that. Progress is not inevitable. I think we really need to stop thinking, and I think hopefully more and more we've stopped that, but we need to stop thinking that progress is inevitable, that things are always going to get better, and things are not getting better, and things haven't been getting better for quite a while now, and quite a lot of things are getting a hell of a lot worse, and very, very quickly. Just to give you an example, I mean, the obvious ones obviously are the climate emergency and things like that, but something that I'm more an expert in. Aaron and I did not see illiberal racism coming back to the forefront of politics that quickly. Like we knew that, like we've been talking in the book about the fuzzy borders between liberal and illiberal racism, and that illiberal racism would rise up and so on. But we didn't see it coming back that quickly to the point that it would lead to the Capitol riots and things like that, for example. So it shows how quickly things can become a lot worse if actually we don't find for radical progress. And also, why should the far right want radical reaction and succeed in it to some extent? And we just like, oh, we just need to take it slow. Let's have reconciliation first with these fascists, and then then we can try and have a little bit fairer society. I think we need to be bolder because the enemies of democracy and equality and justice are bold, and things are getting worse. And it's not just in the hands of humans anymore. It's also the climate emergency that needs to be addressed rapidly, and that the current system that we live in, which is again linked to white supremacy, which comes with certain privileges that some people will not want to give up on, but also capitalism, which also comes with some privileges that people will not want to give up on, and so on and so forth. Some people have a lot to lose if we all are to have a just, equal, and fair society, and these people will not lose these things without a fight, right? And I think, yeah, it's the idea that progress is slow frustrates me, and the idea that we need to be reasonable, that we need to be moderate, from my point of view, is such a cop-out. And quite often, the people who will tell you that benefit from the system, look, I benefit from the system, take progress slowly, that's fine. I have my comfortable house, I earn a good salary, I have a job that is fairly secure, all of these kind of things, right? I would probably have a lot better career if I actually played the game a bit better. And I told you, you know what, Joey, just take it slow. Things are going to get better. Don't worry, right? I'd pat you on the back and there you go. But like, that's not right. That's not how it is. It's like I'd be lying to myself and I'd be lying to you if I said that. And I don't know what is needed, and I don't know what radical change means, and I don't want to know, and I don't think it's for me to say it either. But I think if we want democracies that are worthy of a name, yeah, we need radical change, because at the moment it's a bit of a joke, really.
It's funny because the podcast is named after one of James Baldwin's books, The Fire Next Time, and he has this interview from the 80s. Actually, I took it out when you were talking, just so I can quote it. And he was asked about change. Like, he was literally asked about hasn't there been enough change? And what's funny in quotation, is that if you watch some of the documentaries that he's been in or he's featured in, you have questions given to him in the, I think, 60s, 70s, and 80s, basically the same question. Like, it was the really same question, like, hasn't there been enough progress, or hasn't there been progress? Usually it's how it's phrased. And he has this from the 80s. He was asked that question as well, and he said, I was born here almost 60 years ago. I am not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taking my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brothers and sisters' time. It's taking my ancestors' time. How much time do you want for your progress? I'll find that clip. It's on YouTube. And there's another, it was part of his Oxford or Cambridge or whatever debate that he did with some libertarian right-wing dude. I forgot his name, but anyway, and he was quoting or paraphrasing a recent statement by one of the Kennedys. I forgot which Kennedy, not the president. I think his brother or something. And because that person had said, like, in 50 years, it's not inconceivable that we will have a black president. And that was like in the 60s. And he paraphrased that and says, like, we already had Bobby Kennedy, that's the one. That we already had Bobby Kennedy saying, like, in 50 years, if you're good, we might have a, he would have used Negro president at the time, an African American president. And Baldwin basically said, like, we've been here for 400 years, African Americans, and this guy who just came off the boat, referring to the Kennedy family, tells us that if we're good, maybe in 50 years we can become president. And so that kind of, it's both funny and really not funny at the same time, because it does, complement what you were saying about this notion of progress. Progress for whom? What counts as progress? What counts as speed? What counts as, and I don't want to pretend like I'm completely not part of the system. I mean, of this problem. I mean, I live in Geneva. I live in Switzerland. Despite all of the issues I have with visas and whatnot, I've always more or less found a way to get by, or at least to survive, which other people don't. And there's always these multiple layers. But it's kind of an odd transition, but I do want us to get, if that's okay, to kind of get a bit, and speaking of Geneva, to kind of get into what's happening in France, our neighbors. A lot of, I do still find, I find it a bit frustrating, to be honest, that it's not being talked about as much as I would have hoped it would be talked about by now. And maybe this does speak again to the issues with elites, that we are often so bad at recognizing when a problem is a problem, and just the intensity of the problem, maybe the speed of the problem, because the far right is being normalized in France pretty rapid, in many ways, maybe faster than it was normalized in the US at the time. And unlike in the US, and you mentioned studying the US, UK, and France, so maybe I'll try and make those comparisons, even though comparisons are never perfect or even good. But there is a sense in the US of a diverse American, right? Like the category of American being hyphenated. You can really be anything and also be an American. And I spoke about this in my conversation with Rim Sarah Alwan, that there was this interaction between Trevor Noah. I have a lot of issues with him, but that's not the problem here. Who is, of course, Black South African, and the host of the Daily Show in the US. And he, when the French team, the football team won, he said that this is also a victory for Africa. And he meant it tongue in cheek, it didn't really matter. But there was a pretty fierce reaction from a lot of French people, including French politicians. In French, I think it was the French ambassador to the US or something, who responded to him and said, like, unlike in the US, us in France don't have hyphenated or whatever, as if he was like, his argument was that we're better. We don't see color, to go back to that sentence, of course. And yet what we're seeing in France is pretty remarkable right now. And I want just, and here I'm kind of borrowing what you yourself said, because it's not just a normalization of the far right in the sense that more people are becoming far right. I think that's kind of a wrong, although probably happening on some level, but I think that's the wrong framework. But also this actual overwhelming presence of this absence, of abstention, right? And the recent votes that we saw in France, the biggest story wasn't actually that the Front National was winning or losing, whether Macron was winning or losing, but how many people were simply not voting. And that seems to be a bigger problem. You mentioned Trump being elected by a minority. You mentioned Brexit, of course. What is this issue of abstention as you're studying it? How does it fit in with what we've been talking about of the populist hype? And what is, that's a pretty broad question, I know, but what are we missing? We, the media, the elites, the what have you. What are we missing when we don't pay attention or don't give abstention the attention that it needs? Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, abstention is notoriously hard to study for very good reasons, right? The people who abstain are very unlikely to kind of answer surveys or even talk to researchers and things like that. And I think one of the caveats, I mean, when I talk about abstention or when I write about abstention, people tell me, oh, but you need to be careful. We don't know what abstainers think. And I'm not pretending to know what the people who abstain think. It's not my, it's not my responsibility. It's not my issue. It's not what I claim to be doing. All I'm saying is that we need to take abstention seriously, because abstention can have many meanings, just like it can be just people being lazy because, it's a nice day outside and they want to do something else than vote. It can also be a political statement, or it can just be people being fed up or not being recognized. And if you look at trends, and if you look at actually how unevenly spread abstention is, whether based on age or socio-demographic categories and things like that, it's not, if there's 20% abstention, it's not going to be spread across all these categories. It's going to be, the poorer you are, generally, the younger you are, the more likely you are to abstain. And I think there are good reasons behind that. Some of them are political, some of them might not be. If you forced everyone to vote, I don't know where people would vote. But the point is, we are democracies and we shouldn't force people to vote. People should have a choice not to vote, because again, it is a statement and it is a choice. It's interesting because after the regional elections in France, where there was massive abstention, record abstention, I said in a way, like a bit tongue-in-cheek, I said, well, actually, the people who abstain have more reasons or have better reasons to complain about the election results than the people who voted, because actually the people who abstained decided not to play by the rules of a system that they think is flawed potentially. And some people got really upset, telling me that actually it's a duty rather than a right to vote and things like that. And it's like, well, that's incredibly condescending. And I think, we shouldn't have to vote for things that we deeply dislike. As I said earlier on, the first time I voted was in 2002, and I ended up having to vote for Jacques Chirac, who was, as far away from my political beliefs as possible, bar the Front National. It's like, it's not what democracy should be about. It's not like when people tell you, but you have to vote, it's a duty, people died for it. I don't think they died for it for me to have the choice to vote between Jacques Chirac and Jean-Marie Le Pen. No one would have died for that. I'm sorry. The people who died for the right to vote didn't die for this kind of politics to be justified and legitimized through voting. And so I think we need to look at voting far more again. This is nothing new. Lots of people have talked about it. If you look at just at French history, in the 1848 revolution, which was really one of the kind of main revolutions in France, the kind of working class and people like Auguste Blanqui, for example, when the liberals said, okay, let's have elections, the revolutionaries said, no, let's not have elections just yet. If you have elections now, the people are going to vote for things that they think they know, and the things they think they know are the things that have been told by the elite and the monarchists and the liberals, not by actually us. So let's have first a discussion for 6 months, and then maybe we'll have an election. But let's have people should vote for things that they understand, know, and they can discuss, right? Otherwise, you just ask them to vote on something they don't necessarily understand, or they don't have a choice in the matter. And we need to move away from understanding democracy as simply elections, and as elections as just this kind of transfer of power to people who actually are not like us, to people we don't necessarily agree with, and to voting for the least worst. And I think we need to reclaim other forms of democracy, and we see these forms of democracies all the time. Again, and I'm mentioning the Black Lives Matter movement because I think that's one of the ones that has really given me hope in a way, in changing discourse and in changing things as well. And we need to kind of reclaim these ways of doing democracy, because what we're seeing in France at the moment is appalling, and it's appalling in so many ways. And it's, you mentioned that it was a fast mainstreaming of a far right, but actually it's something that has taken quite a lot of time. And the far right has been very clever and very good at imposing their issues, not to the people. The far right still doesn't do that well in elections. When you look at the entire population, they do far too well from my point of view, right? I'm not downplaying the results that the far right get or the support they get. They have far more support than they should. But considering how much coverage they received, considering how the distrust in the mainstream elite, considering how their issues have been mainstreamed by these same mainstream elites and so on and so forth, they're actually not doing all that well, all things considered. And most people still don't vote for the far right. And yet no one talks to these people. No one talks about these people, right? Instead, all we talk about are issues that don't relate to their day-to-day lives. We talk about Islam, we talk about all these things. And I'm not saying that the people who don't vote, or the people who vote, or the French people, whatever you want to call the people who live in France, I'm not saying that these people don't buy into these ideas. Of course, some of them do, because that's all they hear about. But they buy into them into completely skewed manners. But they don't buy into them out of kind of real democratic belief. I mean, for example, some surveys have shown that I think the surveys were done in 2016, and they were done across various countries. And one of the questions that people were asked were, according to you, out of 100 people, how many are Muslims in France? Guess what the average was?
70, 54.
Not quite, 33. So people thought 33%. So a third of, 31, I think. Yeah. So almost a third of the population was French. Then they said, according to you, in 2020, out of 100, how many will be Muslim? And they said 40%. It's mad. 4 out of 10 French people being Muslim. You know, the truth is 7 to 8%. And then these people were asked, following that question, they were asked, when I say Muslim, what do you think about? And of course, they didn't think about, like, you know, the Muslim lawyer or the Muslim cashier or the Muslim person who, you know, is a nurse or whatever. No, and who they see on a daily basis. They thought about the terrorist, they thought about the faceless refugee, all of these kind of things that, you know, bring up some kind of negative feelings and so on. And so you get then people, you ask people then to vote for these, you know, to vote when this is the things that they're talking about and this is the things that they talk to about. And that leads to, again, you know, this kind of hyping of these issues. And yet, the far right still doesn't do. They do far too well, and I don't want to downplay it, because sometimes I'm accused to not taking the far right seriously, even though I've spent 20 years of my life taking it very seriously. But what I'm saying, what I want to stress is that there are other issues we can talk about, and people, despite the disproportionate coverage of the far right, despite how bad things have become, despite how hyped issues of immigration, racism, Islam have been, people are still interested in other things. And of course they are. I mean, look, like when you have unemployment, when you have precarious work, when you have when you fear about your pension, when you fear about your education, when you fear about the cost of food, the quality of food, when you fear pandemics, things like that, why would Islam be your main issue? You know, it's like, it's mad, it's crazy. And yet that's all we talk about, because it's a nice diversion away from actually issues that would require radical change to the way we run our societies. And that would mean that a lot of people would actually lose out as well in the process. So yeah, diversion, right? Divide and conquer.
Yeah, there's a lot there. There are, first of all, like on abstention, right? There were we're recording this on June 23rd, 2021, obviously, and there was the vote in Switzerland not last Sunday, the one before, on the CO2 law, and it passed, as in, like, now we have an even worse CO2 law than we did before, which was already pretty bad, by only like 100,000 votes. And there was something like 2 million registered voters who did not vote, who abstained. And there was very little coverage, even to this day, on those 2 million, because, I mean, if we're talking about 100,000, it's a pretty small number compared to the fact that 2 million people didn't vote. And that would have been a much more interesting conversation that maybe if we've been having, and maybe next time there wouldn't be these 2 million people vote. And I mean, putting aside that I agree that democracy isn't just election, obviously, it's just part of the picture here. The other thing is, whenever you do have a rise in electoral politics of green parties, it almost never gets as much attention. You don't have this, I mean, sometimes, but usually you don't, like, talks of like, what does this green wave mean? Like, what does it mean that you have so many more people now that vote for green parties than they do for what have you? Why isn't that also part of, like, the collapse of those mainstream political parties? Because we almost only hear of the collapse of mainstream political parties if there is then the far right that is taking up that space, right? And at the time, I mean, remember with the French elections, there was a bit of that. Of course, Macron was seen as the lesser evil compared to Marine Le Pen. I mean, he is. Marine Le Pen is just much worse. But he was seen as also just the savior, essentially, which of course he's not. And what I'm worried about, and I mean, I think you would agree, now with next year's elections, I'm not concerned that Marine Le Pen is going to get a lot of votes. I mean, that is a concern, and I'm concerned in the same way that you mentioned. I'm just concerned of what's going to happen when it comes to abstention. I don't think she can win because people like her. There is a small possibility, but it is there, that she might make it to the second round, and then after that, because of the amount of abstentions. And that's what I'm really worried about, especially that there's only a year left. So when does it, this is kind of go back to my question about, like, in some ways also about populist hype, like the role of what the consequences of that. how do you view it in the context of France? Just because I want us, if it's okay, to talk a bit more about France, because we haven't as much. The one thing that Rim Saralwan again mentioned a lot is a lot of the issues happening over there, if we're situating ourselves in France here, as in the UK and in the US, don't happen over here. You know, we don't have the same kind of racial problem. We don't have the same kind of blah blah blah. We know that that's not true. I mean, you and I know this. Listeners probably know this as well. But what is the role of the populist hype in obfuscating those kinds of problems, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. There's a lot of points there. Well, just to start with, I think, if we think about the 2022 elections and what may or may not happen and how abstention plays out, I think, it brings up some interesting points about discourse and what is primed as well, and what the way we reflect about elections and how that sets the course then for public discourse over the next few years. I mean, think about I mentioned earlier in the podcast 2002, and how we should have talked about abstention. We should have talked about distrust in mainstream politics, and instead we talked about the Front National. 2017 is exactly the same, right? 2017, what happens is 4 candidates are within 100,000 votes or a couple of 100,000 votes, which is nothing, right, in a country like France. And had it been a little bit different, then we could have had Macron versus the right-wing candidate François Fillon, and Le Pen ditched from the second round, or we could have had Macron versus the radical left candidate, who I have lots of issues with, but nonetheless we could have had a completely different landscape. All right. Thing is, it didn't happen, and that's fine. That's the rules of the game. Whatever, the first to get through, whether they're good or not, is irrelevant here in the point that I'm trying to make, at least. Why didn't we spend the next 5 years talking about the fact that 4 different alternatives almost got to the second round? Because what we've been talking about since is in 2022, we're going to have Macron versus Le Pen again. So let's talk about these issues. What was fascinating about Macron in 2017 is that on some issues, he was a real breath of fresh air. I had no faith in him doing anything good about it, but he was a breath of fresh air, even compared to the left in France. For example, what he was saying about colonization was quite different. He seemed to be making noise about finally apologizing. Yeah, so Macron was saying was making some good noise with regard to colonization. He was also making some kind of he had some good sound bites about Islam as well, trying to kind of say that, the problem wasn't Islam, wasn't Muslims,
even sorry to cut you off, even about the Veldiv, the deportation of French Jews, he was more progressive on it than some people on the left even. So that, I also had that impression at the time.
But of course, he was playing a game, right? He was trying to appeal to different people, and he gets elected against Marine Le Pen. And what he does, and I think what he tried to do, and I don't know if he did it consciously or not, and to some extent it's irrelevant because the damage is done, is that he focused his entire 5 years fighting the far right. And so he moved to the right, he completely ditched the left and any issues of the left. He appointed a minister of the interior, Darmanin, who became even more far right than Marine Le Pen herself. I mean, there's this absolutely amazing debate between the two, where Darmanin calls Marine Le Pen too soft on Islam, and your listeners should Google that, because the face that Marine Le Pen pulls is fantastic. She's shocked, she's happy, she doesn't know how to react. It's oh my god, this guy is actually more racist than I am.
Yeah, he gave her an amazing gift, because she easily said after that, well, no, I have nothing against Islam, I'm just against extremists, and he just gave her on a golden plate. It was an amazing win for her.
And you can see liberal racism here. It's not about Islam, it's about Islamism, right? Yeah, right. As if that's how it kind of carries across in public discourse. But yeah, what a gift, right? And he's been doing that on everything. He's been doing that on cancel culture. He's been doing that on free speech, on Islam, on critical race theory as well. All these kind of things, that are brought in from the US, which is funny because the US are saying that these things are brought in from France as well, and so on and so forth. So I mean, there's a lot of issues, and I think France is particularly ripe for this kind of moral panics in a way, because, and that goes back to liberal racism that we talked about early on, because the way the mainstreaming of racism in France took place, or the resurgence of racism took place, because of course France has been systemically racist for a long time, but what we look at really is how it works in public discourse. And the way racism made a comeback in France through liberal racism was by hijacking mostly the concept of laicity, of secularism, which proved very useful to target fantasized Muslim communities in a way, or the fantasized Muslim community. Well, in fact, there are Muslim communities in France with lots of people very different, believing in different things, having different practices, and so on and so forth. But what it did is that it essentialized these people, in a way that was different from the old kind of forms of racism that was anti-Arab, for example, of the early Front National, and instead it moved them into this kind of secularist anti-Islam thing, which is, in France, we don't see color, we don't see religion, blah, blah, blah. But it was completely, it wasn't what the laws of laicity were about. They were against the Catholic Church, which was incredibly powerful, something that Islam is not, because it's not shaped the way Catholicism is, and also it's also a minority, and it's a minority that is mostly oppressed in France, that doesn't have access to much of a public discourse or anything like that. So it's got nothing to do with 1905, but also the law of 1905 said that it would punish people who forced a religion onto someone else, but also it would punish people who were forced not to have a religion by someone else. So, it's like, it was actually very kind of liberal in a sense, and fairly kind of like individualistic. So it was never about forcing people not to have a religion, and certainly it was never about forcing people not to wear particular garments the way it has been in France with the law of 2004 against the hijab in schools, the law of 2011 against the burqa, and more recently the burkini and various other kind of moral panics that have been arising. And so this has allowed people to just say incredibly racist things on TV, in the National Assembly, absolutely everywhere, and look progressive to some extent, because what they were saying was not racist, it was just secularist, it was just laicity. And what's fascinating is to look at the media coverage of Islam in France, and like the number of headlines that have been written about in magazines, in newspapers, the number of debates on television that have been done about like the taboo of Islam. You can't talk about Islam anymore in France. I was like, you can't talk about Islam except everywhere on primetime TV, on front pages of newspapers, everywhere we talk about Islam, except Muslim people are never invited to talk about Islam unless they're tokens that are used by the government to kind of push anti-Islam narratives. And yet it works. It's fascinating. It's like these people keep doing it, and it's like, surely they realize what they're doing, right? But it got to a point where the pressure that some people are in France, like anti-racist people are in France, is insane. With people like Rokhaya Diallo, like who's a brilliant journalist and writer, like the strength she has to fight back against 99% of the media that's against her, day in, day out, when she says things that are, that should be incredibly obvious and accepted, but she shouldn't even have to say anymore about the state of racism in France. And what she copes is mad, and I think, this has been a long process. The far right has done very well. The mainstream right has been appalling. The mainstream left has been appalling. The radical left bought into laicity in an exclusionary manner. There were also external events that took place, like the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, which of course were terrible, but then the way they were reconstructed led to kind of further mainstreaming of racism, as we've explored in an edited collection called After Charlie Hebdo. So there's lots of things coming together, which lead us to a point where it's really hard to be publicly, and like, it's not hard as in like you're not going to be hunted down, although some people are, but to be anti-racist in mainstream, in the mainstream media landscape and political landscape in France, people have to be careful, otherwise you just get completely sidelined in a way. And some people cope a lot of very, very violent abuse, like Rokhaya Diallo, who she's incredible to keep fighting, because a lot of people would have given up in her place.
No, for sure. I interviewed, I was looking up the name of the group, La Jeune Garde spokesperson, Raphaël Arnaud. That's the anti-fascist group, one of the anti-fascist groups in Lyon after that attack by the Génération Identitaire, what was it, in March of this year. And you mentioned the laws of secularism and all of that in France. I will also link back to the conversation I had with Rim Zaralouan, because she's a legal scholar in France, of course, and so she also explained that a lot. So if people want to expand, their knowledge on that, they can check out that episode. Again, this is episode 72. So one last thing before I ask, can I get into the book section if that's okay? You mentioned, I think today or like a few days ago on Twitter, I was doing my research that there seems to be a very clear inability or unwillingness to treat fascism as a serious danger in France, right? And you even mentioned how like your own research topic is fairly unpopular in France right now. I feel like you already talked about it, but can you kind of, do you have a comment on that? That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's even in, yeah, I mean, it's again, like I have so much sympathy for my colleagues in France who are working on anti-racism and on racism even. Even my colleagues who are, I mean, most of them would be working from an anti-racist perspective, but just even studying racism is so difficult in France at the moment. Look, I mean, there's a reactionary backlash in the UK. There's one in the US. It's everywhere, right? Like, the more panics about CRT, free speech, all of these kind of things. I mean, under this government in the UK, things are not great either. But at least we can talk about it. I don't think anyone is really. We feel like that we feel like sometimes it's a losing battle because the kind of forces against us are massive. But at least we can talk about it. We can publish. We can do our work. But in France, it's so incredibly difficult. And we've seen in France in academia some conferences on Islamophobia being cancelled. Because you can't talk about Islamophobia because there's no such thing as Islamophobia. I mean, it's incredible how people in government or around government has bought into the myths about Islamophobia, the fact that Islamophobia was created by extremist Muslims, and things like that. I mean, it's just been debunked millions of times, right? I know there's lots of very serious research on Islamophobia, but somehow, yeah, that doesn't get through to them. So yeah, I mean, it's look, I mean, I'm fairly small fish, right? So it's fine if French people don't read my work, but ironically, I've been invited to many countries to give talks in many countries around Europe, and even in the US and Australia. But in France, yeah, very, very rarely. So yeah, but I think it's not about it's nothing to do with me really, and it's fine. It doesn't bother me too much, and but I think it makes me really sad for my colleagues who are doing really important work in France and it doesn't get through. And instead, the things that are being published, even by academic presses, sometimes are incredibly reactionary as well and play into these ideas of white working class and so on. And it does happen here in the UK. It happens in the US as well, but there's more of a counter voice, I think, than there is in France at the moment. And yeah, I think it's really, really worrying, the state of public discourse in France. And again, when I say public discourse, I include academia to that as well, which yeah, I think is quite grim, especially because funding is also a lot worse there at the moment. So
yeah. I'll probably think of more names that I'll put in the description, but there's a couple of podcasts for those listening on France, like there's La Poudre, and there is Quoi de Meuf, and there's Kif Taras, and those are quite good podcasts in French for those who speak French. But anyway, I'm gonna try and do as much as I can on France. It's a country like I'm personally linked to with family and stuff, but it's also like I'm in Geneva, which is like literally surrounded by France, which is a bit funny. But anyway, so with all of that in mind, that was pretty like exhaustive and fascinating, and I really thank you for your time. Can we kind of get into the book section, in which I just ask you like to recommend 3 books that you've enjoyed and just explain why?
Yeah, I do. It's been hard to kind of narrow it down to 3 books, but what I kind of came up with was a list of probably 2 of the books that have been most important to me over the years in kind of framing my research, my work, and the way I understand the world, I guess. And the third one is something more recent that has kind of marked me in a way as like, that has really kind of energized me. So I thought I would end up in a more kind of positive way. So the first book is Jacques Rancière's The Hatred of Democracy. I think it's 2005, if I'm correct, but I think it's still incredibly relevant. So Jacques Rancière is a French philosopher, and he's done a lot of work on the working class, on democracy, on politics as well, and what he calls politics and the police. This book is very, very, it's a very easy read, so it's not kind of hardcore philosophy. It's probably 150 pages or something like that, and it's very much about some of the things that we've talked about today, about this idea that the people who pretend that they are leading our democracies can actually hate our democracies and why they do. And it's also about alternatives to reimagining democracy and reimagining what democracy could be if we actually went back to the sources of democracies, which is power of the people, but also power of the people removed from any forms of hierarchical power. So if you remove all forms of potential hierarchies that would impose the power of someone onto someone else or onto others, what would it look like? And so he talks about things like, like the lottery, for example, and deciding who governs us by lottery and all of these kind of things. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's a book that really does kind of mean a lot to me in terms of my early kind of entry into kind of politics and academia and so on, because this is not a media that I come from at all. Another book that was really important to me to start understanding racism better. I mean, obviously, it's worth noting that I'm white, right? So I don't suffer from racism. I never have, and I don't claim to speak on behalf of racialized people in any way, shape, or form. The way I study racism is really from my perspective, which is the people who benefit from racist structures and white supremacy. So it's what I'm trying to do, what I would aim to do in the end is become a race traitor in a way, the way some people have talked about it. And one of the books that have really been important to me to kind of understand racism better is, and I could have picked many others, but this one I keep going back to, is Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists. And so Bonilla Silva is an American sociologist who wrote this book in 2006, if I'm correct. There's been a couple of editions since. And what he did is he went to American campuses. And so he interviewed like the elite of the United States in a way, and he talked to them about racism. And what he comes up with is this kind of framework of what he calls colorblind racism, which is people who think of themselves as not racist and as probably anti-racist, but actually buy into more subtle forms of racism. So it's kind of fairly similar to while we build our concept of liberal racism builds very much on Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racist or colorblind racism. And the final book is one of the books that really kind of energized me a lot in the last couple of years. It's Lola Olufemi's Feminism Interrupted. I really loved that book. It made me angry, but in a good way. And I think we need anger, right? And again, this is nothing new, and this is something that a lot of kind of people have written about. I could have given another book, which is Bell Hooks on rage as well. And I think we need that anger, we need that rage, we need to be more radical, and we shouldn't be scared about demanding radical change because the enemies of democracy, of justice, of good really are being radical. And if we're not, we're going straight into the wall. So that's a book that I would really recommend as well. Feminism Interrupted, I thought was really nice.
Well, thanks a lot for that. I Feminism Interrupted came into my view recently. I'm gonna see if I can read it and maybe even interview Lola. We'll see. But thanks a lot, Aurelien. Thanks a lot for your time. This has been amazing conversation. I'm sure listeners would agree with me.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. So pleasure.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.